A few years ago, when our daughter was a toddler, my wife and I would often take her to a nearby lake to picnic, swim, and relax. It was a quiet, peaceful place, rarely crowded, and just secluded enough to make us feel like we were worlds away. One afternoon, after finishing lunch, my wife decided to take a quick swim while I stayed on the beach with our daughter. I watched as she waded into the water, the sunlight dancing on the lake's surface. She was about waist deep when she suddenly stopped, turning to me with an expression that was off. She shouted something, but at first I couldn't make it out. Then I heard her clearly. "I think I just stepped on someone's face." For a second I froze, half expecting her to laugh, maybe say it was a joke. But she didn't. Her face was pale and tense, not a hint of humor in her eyes. She turned and made her way back to the shore quickly, almost stumbling as if she couldn't get out of the water fast enough. When she reached me, she was visibly shaken. She explained that as she was swimming, her foot had brushed against something soft. At first, she thought it might be a rock or some strange patch of weeds. But when she pressed down, she felt the distinct shape of a face, a nose, an eye socket. She said she even felt the hollow where the eye should have been. I thought about going in myself to see what it was, but something deep down held me back, like an instinct to just leave it alone. We decided to pack up and leave immediately. The next day, we saw on the local news that a young boy who had been missing for days was found drowned in that very lake, close to where we had been. He had been lying just beneath the surface, hidden in the depths. To this day, my wife is convinced she stepped on his face, and the memory still haunts her. I live in a village near a small forest filled with slender trees. When I was about 12, a close friend and I were out playing in a field near the edge of those woods. We were just wandering around, picking up sticks and hitting them against rocks or trees as kids do. We'd been in this forest countless times before, so we weren't thinking much of it, just chatting and joking as we passed the trees, occasionally brushing up against them as we walked. Then, all at once, we both stopped. Just ahead, maybe 10 or 15 meters away, there was something. I was taken aback, but not exactly afraid. At first, I thought it might be a boar because of its strange, pig-like nose. But as I looked closer, its body seemed more like that of a German shepherd. Odd enough, but the strangest part was yet to come. It moved behind one of those narrow trees, as if it was passing through, and then simply disappeared. It didn't go far enough around the tree to be out of sight. It just stepped behind it and never came out the other side. I stared at the spot, trying to make sense of it. After a few seconds, I whispered to my friend, "Did you see that?" There was no response. Another few seconds passed, and when I looked back, he was sprinting away, faster than I'd ever seen him run. That was enough for me. I bolted out of the forest as fast as I could, and we didn't stop until we were safely back in the field. We looked back, half expecting to see it following us, but the creature, or whatever it was nowhere to be found. To this day, I have no idea what we saw. If it had been a regular animal, it likely would have run off with all the noise we'd been making earlier. I still live near the same woods, but I've never seen that creature again. Some nights, though, I still hear strange sounds drifting from the forest and the field, echoing through the darkness. Looking back on my life, I'm flooded with memories of unexplainable events. I could probably write a whole book on the strange things I've witnessed that defy any reasonable explanation. I grew up in a single-story, 3-bedroom house with a large field behind it and a patch of woods to one side. I loved that house and the surrounding woods, despite the many strange experiences I had there. This particular event is one of my top 5, not because it was the weirdest, but because of the eerie feeling it left behind. I've seen stranger things, but this one's easier to describe. My mom worked nights, leaving my older brother to watch over my younger brother and me. My younger brother and I would often sit on my mom's bed and watch TV, sometimes dozing off there. This night, I fell asleep in the middle of a movie. When I woke up a few hours later, my younger brother was fast asleep beside me. I sat up and glanced over at the digital alarm clock. It read 1:47 a.m. in bright red lights. But the next instant, with just a blink, the time changed to 3:30 a.m. My stomach dropped. A wave of fear washed over me, not just because of the 2 missing hours, but because the whole energy in the room had shifted. Everything suddenly felt off, a feeling I knew well from past experiences. The atmosphere grew heavy and tense, the kind of silence that raises every hair on your body. Then from the field behind our house, I heard what sounded like 20 wolves howling. It was a deep, eerie chorus of howls unlike anything I'd heard before or since. There aren't any wolves where we live, no coyotes either. Dogs, sure, but a whole pack of them howling together at 3 a.m.? I couldn't shake the feeling that what I was hearing was something other. At the time, I chalked it up to a strange dream, something my imagination had cooked up in that unnerving stillness. But years later, I shared the memory with my older brother. That's when he told me he'd heard the howling that night too. He remembers it clearly, because that unearthly choir of howls is not a sound you forget. It wasn't just me. Something strange was out there that night, and neither of us has ever been able to explain it. On the 4th of July weekend in 2011, my friend Todd found himself in a wildly unexpected situation. Here's how he recounted the story to me. It was supposed to be a fun weekend away at Todd's friend Troy's cabin in the woods. Todd was excited, not only for the holiday, but because Troy had invited a girl for Todd to meet. They hit it off, and before long, Todd and his date found themselves downstairs for some alone time. A little while later, Troy headed out for a bit, leaving the two of them alone in the cabin. Todd and his date were preoccupied when they heard unfamiliar voices upstairs. Curious, Todd went up to investigate and found that Troy had returned with someone else, Ace, a guy Todd didn't get along with. Annoyed by Ace's presence, Todd and Troy got into an argument in the middle of the living room. Just as things got tense, Troy's girlfriend entered the room, looking confused. Todd, realizing he was in his boxers, grabbed Troy and continued the argument downstairs, trying to keep things out of everyone else's sight. Finally, Troy suggested they all cool off with a night swim at a nearby creek. He grabbed the first pair of shorts he saw, Todd's, and left with his girlfriend and Ace, not realizing Todd's wallet, keys, and cigarettes were in the shorts pocket. A few minutes later, Todd discovered his things were gone and was furious, but tried to brush it off and went back downstairs with his date. Later that night, Todd heard Troy and company return. He rushed upstairs to confront him and demanded his shorts back. As the argument escalated, Troy refused to strip down in front of everyone, and Ace tried to intervene, which only made things worse. Frustrated, Todd and his date finally gave up and went back downstairs. Meanwhile, Troy, his girlfriend, and Ace headed out again, with Troy still wearing Todd's shorts. But when morning came, Todd realized Troy hadn't returned. Another day passed with still no word from Troy. Ace and Todd's date waited around, hoping he'd show up. But when the third morning came and Troy was still missing, Todd grew worried. Calls to Troy's girlfriend went unanswered. Finally, Todd called a few friends to help search the woods near the cabin, but after hours of searching, they found nothing. As panic set in, Todd decided it was time to report Troy missing. When Troy's girlfriend filed the report, she mentioned the argument she'd witnessed between Todd and Troy, which only complicated things. Todd's reputation for fighting worked against him, and he became the main suspect. On the third morning, Todd, his date, and Ace were startled awake by the sound of SWAT officers kicking in the door and running on the roof. They were handcuffed and questioned, with Todd bearing the brunt of suspicion. Meanwhile, a search team combed the woods around the cabin, hoping for some clue to Troy's whereabouts. After hours of intense questioning, Todd insisted that every minute they spent on him was time wasted in finding Troy. What Todd didn't know was that search teams had finally found him, miles from the cabin, unconscious on a large rock deep in the woods. He was dehydrated, sunburned, and completely disoriented but alive. A rescue helicopter arrived, and the SWAT team released Todd just in time for him to see Troy being flown in, suspended in a rescue harness. The events of the night unraveled soon after. Apparently, Troy and his girlfriend had gone for a walk to cool down after the argument. Unbeknownst to Troy, his girlfriend had swiped his debit card, which sparked an argument once he found out. They separated, and she made her way to the main road, called for a ride, and left Troy alone in the woods, assuming he'd find his way back. She turned off her phone for 2 days, ignoring his calls while she partied with friends. When she finally turned her phone back on, she was shocked to hear Todd's worried messages about Troy's disappearance. By that point, Troy was so lost he'd wandered miles into the wilderness. He'd somehow survived on rainwater and the occasional wild berry he managed to find. By the time he was found, he was weak. But remarkably, he made a full recovery. A few weeks later, Todd decided to move out of state, leaving behind this strange chapter of his life. His friendship with Troy dissolved, and as far as he knows, Ace and Troy's girlfriend faded from the scene too. Yet, despite the years that have passed, I doubt any of them will ever forget those 3 chaotic days in the cabin.